This podcast contains discussions around misogyny with brief mentions on non-consensual touching and restraint. Viewer discretion is advised. Have you ever had a particularly bad dream? One that you would do almost anything to wake up from? Have you woken up from that dream only to find your body to still be sleeping, but your mind feels awake? Maybe you wake to find you can't move a single muscle. Not even an inch. You can't shout, can't cry, can't even twitch a finger. But your eyes are open. You can feel the bed you're lying in. You can see the room around you. It's all familiar. Yet something's off. This experience is known as sleep paralysis, where your body has not yet caught up with your mind, and part of you is still in REM sleep. It can be terrifying, an experience that we still don't fully understand. But what makes this worse, while some might just not be able to move for a few minutes, others, more often than not, will hear voices, see shadows, and some may see figures that either look terrifying or even familiar, but they see them clear as day. And some even feel those people, those figures, sitting right on top of them. See, sleep paralysis is often paired with a sensation of being touched, or specifically having a pressure on your chest. Paired with visual hallucinations, it can be quite terrifying. But what makes it even more interesting is that figure that people often see is described to be an older woman. And this experience happens to many people in many different cultures, where they see very strikingly similar things. When one experiences sleep paralysis, when they see an old woman coming towards them as their body refuses to listen to their commands for it to move, that experience is often known as seeing the old hag, or the Mara, or in some cases, the Domovoi, the Kikamora. Sometimes it's even considered a vampire. Sometimes it's simply just called the nightmare. The names go on. Again, we have this experience in every single culture. And in every culture, that experience tends to represent something different, but it solidifies very specific beliefs. Remember in the last episode how I said imagination can be a powerful thing? One that causes us to accuse innocent people of terrible, imaginary crimes? Well, when imagination meets hard-to-explain experiences, that also can fuel our fear, and it can lead to some wild conclusions. My name is Aubrey Blauvelt, and you're listening to Beyond the Folklore. On today's episode, we'll be talking about a folkloric tradition that has many names, but most folks might know it as sleep paralysis, and the narratives people use to explain and understand this strange phenomenon. Joining me today is a fellow PhD student in the German department at CU Boulder. So today I just want to introduce my guest. So tell me a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what your interests are.
Hi, I'm Taylor Budde. I'm a PhD student here at University of Colorado Boulder. I'm working on my dissertation, which has to do with German weird fiction in the early 20th century. So genre fiction, line between fantasy, science fiction, horror in different ways, and how it interacts with a sort of broader international early modern shift in horror fiction and genre fiction.
Yeah, so we kind of have some similar interests going on right now, some things that are crossing over. So I think you're in the right place for this discussion right now. Thank you for joining me. So I guess my first question for you actually is, what do you know about sleep paralysis?
I know biologically very little about it. Some of my previous background work has been more in more, we'll call it Germanic, especially Germanic folklore, Scandinavian folklore, Old Norse mythology and saga. So I am at least familiar with creatures and critters that have been associated with what we would now today call sleep paralysis, and some famous paintings and works depicting them.
Oh, yeah. There are literally tons and tons of different creatures and critters that are connected with sleep paralysis. But, like, science-wise, the sciencey description of it is that it's like when your body has not actually woken up from REM sleep, but your mind kind of has, so then you cannot move. And while in reality, it takes maybe about, like, 5 minutes for that sensation to pass, at the most, it's very short. It can feel like hours. So then that's kind of terrifying to not be able to move, but to be aware. But at the same time, because your body is still in that REM sleep, you often experience hallucinations, whether they're auditory hallucinations or they're like literal visual
Yeah.
hallucinations. So tell me a little bit about what creatures you might know are connected with this sleep disorder.
I mean, I'm trying to remember. There's a famous painting
Mm.
that I will look up at some point during a possible conversation. Has just like a little black imp sitting on a woman who's sort of draped over the side of the bed. That's very dramatic. I think it's on a cover of a translation of Freud's Uncanny, actually. But I mean, from my background, I know of a few different things. Generally, it can be again sort of elves, dwarves have been, associated with it, some sort of like again impish figures
Mhm.
frequently. There's also an association, I mean, likely that we'll talk about today, of even horses as being coming from sort of again, this sort of Scandinavian tradition, and in tandem with that, women who ride the horses, or sometimes just an old woman. Something is sitting on your chest and you cannot move, and it's very scary.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of renditions about it. The most popular one, I would say, is that image that you mentioned at the very end of a woman sitting on your chest, or a woman has like sent something to sit on your chest while she's in the corner of your room staring down at you. That's we have a lot of narratives like that. It's very unsettling. And then the picture that you're talking about, I think it's literally called the nightmare. I will have to fact check that, and I will fact check that later, but I'm pretty sure it's known as The Nightmare is, like, the title of it.
Yeah.
Because more modern renditions of, like, the folklore that is connected with sleep paralysis is known as, like, the old hag, or, like, you have seen the old hag.
Right.
It was maybe during the witch trials, maybe during, like, the 16th century, known just as, like, the nightmare. You experience the nightmare, and then we kinda, like, after having that word, we encompass, like, all bad dreams when it originally was to describe sleep paralysis and seeing or hearing weird things when you were having this moment happen to you.
Right, like it was a verb in a way, right? Like it was a more active thing than just I had a bad dream.
Yeah, that's a really good way of describing them.
Yeah, it's a specific, but I think that's in the Swedish. It's something like being ridden by the, like, right, like there's a specific way you are ridden
You
by
are
something,
it
right?
it was either hag-ridden or witch-ridden.
Yeah.
Yeah, those were literal phrases that were going around, especially during the witch trials of Germany, during the Salem witch trials, especially. If you looked extra tired or if you experienced that, people would be like, "Oh, you're witch-ridden."
Yeah, right. The other like elf dreams too, right?
Yeah.
There's as far as like Germanic sort of linguistics go, they called these sorts of things previously too. So yeah, I guess I don't. What I always think about in tandem with that too is how much of that is coming from a, how to say this, sort of like a preloaded folkloric background, like leading into the expectations that, right, because you have this experience and your brain's trying to fill in these like gaps of like, I am conscious but not quite yet for different reasons. And like as a sensory thing, very scary, right? Freaky. So what do? You try to make sense of it, right? But then how much of that comes from, like, what do I know that can do this sort of thing, right? Like, am I under a spell and then coming this way, right? Or what is frequently from, most of my mom's had this experience before, right? Where she was convinced it's like something was sitting on her.
Wait, your mom?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
I had an episode of this, right? Where she was very convinced that, like, what it felt like to her was like something was physically preventing her from moving, right? It wasn't that she couldn't move, it was that she was being stopped,
yeah.
right? And obviously, like a long, I mean, folkloric back to myth tradition of these like things that can do like curses, things, right? You sort of backfill in there. And then, I mean, contextually, right, you end up with, like you've mentioned, like this, like this figure of a woman, right? The old hag, as you sometimes called, being there or causing this in a way. And how much I guess part of me, and I wonder if you know how much of this is, how far back does that specific figure go in the sense of like, is it predating the witch trials and then becomes much more prominent during the period of witch trials? Or is this even something after where we're looking at like a sort of even like romantic back projection talking about these episodes and coming up with these things, right?
I mean, it definitely predated the witch trials because you have in Jewish folklore, you have Lilith, who then was either connected with or like ascribed as like a succubi. And that was that was the word before nightmare of something coming to you in your sleep, sitting on you and draining your energy. So then those succubi were like almost always expressed to be feminine. And then as the witch trials came up, that like feminine seductress that's sitting on your chest so you can't move switch to like an older ugly woman,
Right.
what they had to assume to be like what a witch looks like, or what they thought a witch maybe secretly looked like when they took off their people face. It kind of stuck around after that because again, because the witch trials were so influential and so impactful globally,
Right.
that then they were like, yes, it's an old woman. And I feel like that was kind of people's way of filling in a gap. Like maybe they didn't specifically see an old woman, they saw a blob
Right.
in the corner, and they were like, well, that looks people shaped, and it specifically looks like this old lady that scares me shaped. So
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously like a lot of these sort of like cultural things too, right? And how do we use supernatural phenomena to explain the unexplainable in absence of other things too, right? Like then these traditions. Um, I mean, of course, in, for example, the Scandinavian tradition, you have like the Bergtagen sort of phenomenon, right? Of someone being taken to the mountains by trolls or some other sort of supernatural entity, in the sense of dad went out to the mountains and came back a changed man, right? Like something happened. Or even in the sense of tying into like changeling tradition, right? Like the idea of your infant having been swapped by for a troll child. But some studies have connected to things like neurodivergency in some ways, where this is less clear cut that, but I think in the same line of like how in the ways in which folklore and this sort of like these specifically like supernatural tinged ones end up being used to describe these sort of phenomena that are difficult to in absence of anything else explained. Like I felt you can't tell someone who's gone through this is like, well, no, this is just your brain tricking you, right? As the person you have is like, no, something was fucking sitting on me.
yeah.
You're not gonna convince me otherwise. um and that proliferates, right? And then it becomes like it passes around. It's like, oh, something happened to Sven the other day.
Yeah, and then when people have, like, similar things happening, like, one person says, "This was my experience," then another person says, "Wait a minute, that was my experience," but they still don't have an explanation for that, that kind of reinforces their biggest fear that this is something supernatural, and with what's going on around them, it's just really, like, confirming their own, like, imaginations, essentially. And on top of that, studies showed that people who worked more, longer hours, had more anxiety, and were more exhausted, were more prone to having sleep paralysis. So then, back in the day, what were people's main jobs? It was mostly manual labor. And so they were exhausted. They were anxious because, especially again, like this goes back to the witch trials again, but like they were anxious because their populations were impacted. They were afraid of their neighbor. They were having diseases going around. They were running out of resources, out of food. That's just gonna increase the likelihood and increase their fears, and then they're having more sleep paralysis nights or
Right.
experiences, and it just takes off from there.
Yeah, I mean, and the historically scary thing about that too, though, is previous to, I guess we can think about it in a sense that was like when it is an elf or like a troll, right? Something like this, like a supernatural entity. You have no access to this, right? Like there's a belief that this is a world or something like you. like you could try to go hunt down the troll, right? Or leave offerings to it in like in this sort of more ritualistic way, right? But when something like this becomes intertwined with, like you said, like the witchcraft trials, right? And gender politics, like just politics in general, right? The historical moment of these things happening, it is worse off, right? Because you have, it's like, well, you know, this lady, right? Or you can identify someone for various social, political, all sorts of different reasons as the cause of this, a way to like then build, public consensus or whatever against this person and have them punished like legally in a way that is obviously troubling, right? And like this long standing tradition, especially with femininity, like women being associated with magic, as far in as many different traditions as far back as forever, right? For four different reasons, and then arriving at that sort of moment in. I mean, it's not necessarily a moment, right? It is like a long developing thing that it's different, right? The approach to witches, and but what do we do about magic, right? Legally, had changes significantly through the medieval period when early on it was less so. Black magic, or early on, black magic is what's punished, right? There's something that's concrete harm for this, et cetera, et cetera. But then with a, more prevalent publications of thoughts and different ideas about witches, right? Obviously, like all magic is like magic becomes associated with the devil. This other like in materially, ontologically evil things that vastly expand the scope and consequences of something as innocuous as, not necessarily innocuous, but as something we now know today to be I mean, this is a natural phenomenon that we can explain, though, in a way, right? At a time when you can, it becomes this very much other thing.
Yeah. I mean, and on top of that, I think what also like gives it people fuels people's fear more is that this is like cross cultural. So they're like looking at this, they're going to other communities are having like these unexplained moments, and they're like, well, it has to be supernatural because nobody outside of my community or inside of my community has an explanation for this. So that's bad. And this is what's happening to me.
Even if it's not part of like an oral record, even, right? Like not necessarily like a written, like, oh, we have documentation for this, right? Which is much less there, right? It's just a more expansive tradition, right? Like how are these things known? They get passed down orally or through these, not necessarily through writing, and proliferate and change, place to place, different to different around the world, really. Yeah. I guess this was something I was thinking about too, was because it's not what I've seen, but positive examples of, or people who come away with it as more of like it's religious epiphany, right? Or something different than I've awoken and have this. It's the fine line, right, between horror and
Like maybe this wasn't so bad.
right? Or even like sublime in the sense of like being literally overcome and then like leaving it, and instead it's just like, oh, that was like literally overcome by the power of God. It's like, right? You have these. I think it's not necessarily something that would always be interpreted negatively as much as it can. Like, right? There's different ways to, I think, explain it in absence of something here.
Well, two things come to mind, and it's not necessarily like positive in terms of like specifically Christian tradition, but there's this spirit that's very believed in Slavic folklore, and like still to this day people do believe in this. It's known as the domovoi. Do you know anything about?
I know nothing about
Okay.
Domovoi, please.
So domovoi is a house spirit. There's like a numerous amount of house spirits in Slavic folklore, but this one is something that's not essentially bad, not necessarily the most positive. Usually it depends on how you treat it. So it's in everybody's household. If you have one, it's a good thing. People, when they experience sleep paralysis in Slavic settings and they believe that they had a domovoi, would be like, oh, it's sitting on my chest to tell me it's not that happy, but at least it's telling me it's there. So then they believe that their house is protected unless you piss it off. And to experience that in the night, like to experience sleep paralysis, and then specifically that feeling of something pressing on your chest, they'd be like, oh, it's a domovoi, it's not a big deal, like it's telling me it's there, like
I haven't done my chores
yeah.
to its satisfaction. I need to do.
Or it's just telling that person that it has arrived. That is like more than anything, it's affirming their belief in it. Like they're saying, oh, I thought this was here. and now I have this sleep paralysis. So it is here, and my house is balanced.
Yeah, I have confirmation
Yeah.
of like where before, I mean, I prior to that, right, you might be questioning whether or not like, oh, I wonder if I have this sort of household spirit here, and then this experience
Yeah.
validates like, oh no, okay, great, I do.
But then the other thing that comes to mind is how often sleep paralysis is not just connected with these images of the old hag, but it's connected with UFO experiences. And sometimes those can be described to be more divine. I know it sounds a little weird, but it can, people who have sleep paralysis sometimes think that they were abducted in their
Right,
sleep.
yeah.
But then that ends up being like, not every narrative, because this is a terrifying experience to have, but a lot of them are like, "Man, like, I couldn't move, but I saw something really beautiful and divine while I was doing that. My, like, mind was still kind of going. There were bright lights. It was like I saw angels, but I think they were aliens." And then that kind of was more of a, like, positive way to take it than a demon is in my room and I can't move.
Right. It's very much the SNL skit with Ryan Gosling. Like post to being abducted. It was like I saw they were made of beautiful light and showed them so many great things, right?
And then you have Kate McKinnon who's
It's
like,
like
"That is not my
but that was not my experience, right?
Yeah, that is very much, like, another way of taking it, but for the majority, I do think it's negative. I mean, like, even myself, I had a sleep paralysis experience. Luckily for me, I saw nothing. I had 2, one where I just couldn't move, and that was terrifying, and then another one where I, like, heard voices, but I knew what sleep paralysis was, and I even had a professor who, in my undergrad, this was my first folklore class ever, we went over old hag tradition and sleep paralysis, and she was like, "Do not read this book on sleep paralysis at night. You might get it." And I was like, I want it." So then I kept reading that book at night, and then I got it, and then I heard like little creepy whispers, but I was like, "Oh wait, I understand what's going on. I don't need to blame anybody."
Right. I mean, I think there's something interesting with like you coming out of our like right like depending on when this like when you're waking up or when this is happening out of whatever cycle, right? Whether you're immediately being ejected out of a dream, which already we cannot get into the dreams at folklore house, whole separate topic. But that like rollover almost, right? Where you kind of you wake up, you're like you're still not certain. Like, wait, am I still asleep? Right? Something fell on the ground, right? And you wake up and you're like, I'm not. What where am I in the cycle, right? Type of thing too. It makes me wonder if like I don't know treatment, right? If I guess if this was a frequent thing that was happening to you enough to go see a doctor and visit about it. I don't know too much about that, but I wonder. Part of me in my head is like, I wonder if lucid dreaming almost would be a way to at least lose the panic aspect of it a bit, right? Of being able to clearly identify like being in and out of whatever sleep state you end up in there too. I mean, that again, that obviously makes sense though with like when we're thinking about this in terms of folklore and the supernatural, right? Is because these are just like background stories, right? Like culturally ingrained things that are always permeating somewhere in our heads, and then finding that association, right? When you're not able to, right? You're not fully conscious yet, and your brain's trying to figure out again, like what is happening to me. And I like the UFO ones too, right? So thinking about in terms of like this is not just we know what the phenomenon is now. Like I'm sure even being explained it, should it happen to you, you might still think like, yeah, aliens, right? Or like modern day folklore, whether, locally, regionally, like what sorts of things could have. Does the Mothman on the East Coast ever come and set up like this sort of like, New Jersey Devil, right? There's
Well, like, the biggest shift today in, like, connecting sleep paralysis with, like, something supernatural is we've really went away from the woman figure that's causing this,
yeah.
and we moved into it's the Hat Man. That's, like in I don't know, I have not dived into, like, why there's a shift from we blamed it on women for so long, and now we're blaming it on this one man with a hat, but that's, like, the most recent narratives are like, "Actually, we see the Hat Man now."
It's like shady government agents. Like, what's the name of the guy in like the X Files, right? Type of thing. I wonder.
Like a Men in Black kinda situation.
Yeah, right. Like again, like different sort of folkloric, sinister figures for us necessarily. That
Well, I mean, if,
which
like
So if you still had a deeply held belief in witches, right, or witchcraft,
Then you're gonna see the witch.
yeah, like it wouldn't shock me if someone who was, an active believer and practitioner of Wicca, or which, these sort of like various modern developments and permutations of these systems, let's say, would have an experience and believe like, oh, I was cursed still, right? I think it might just have more to do with like, well, what is your already preset ideas of belief or like percolating, right? Or like your questions about when things aren't explained, how do you do that in a lot of ways, right? And for me growing up, that wasn't necessarily, witches, but in the night, like X-Files, things are on like this re-revival of things like this. So doesn't shock me that would become like a shift in that
Oh, yeah.
association.
That makes a lot of sense. I guess I didn't think about it, like, why that shift might be happening. Because, like, we're talking about this whole thing, that experience influence beliefs, and then what we know in our environment, what we're afraid of, what our imaginations are telling us. Once we have this unexplained experience, it kinda solidifies that. So now, like, today, we're all scared of the government and what we don't know, like, today there's talks about, like, UFOs. We have seen them.
The whole Roswell background, right? Which is like, I think a much more contemporary sort of, I mean, folklore, really. We can like in a certain sense, that is the sort of the cultural association that goes on there with it in
Yeah.
its own.
And I mean, when this was, like, being documented so much originally, why we still, like, kinda have this idea of the old hag, but we don't actually, when we are experiencing sleep paralysis today, don't connect it, is because the the time that it was, like, the scariest was during the witch trials, which was hugely impactful. So yeah, okay. I do see that. I like that theory. That's why it switched to the Hat Man, because government's scary.
Well, I mean, I know nothing about the Hat Man. It could be, that would be my first guess.
No, it makes sense. It makes total sense.
But you have something. It could be. I mean, Slender Man too. Does Slender Man wear a hat?
No, but he's tall and he's got like a undefined face,
Right.
black suit that is minus the hat that fits the Hat Man.
Right. Yeah. Like this sort of put a hat on Slender Man too type of thing, right? And it's very odd in that sense of the ways in which, like, I've seen a lot of debate vis-a-vis something like Slender Man being legitimate quote unquote folklore or not. Right, and how it, because the way it permutated through the internet, right, and people like independently coming up, like writing these stories, building its own mythology, quote unquote, was sort of an interesting case study for some
Yep.
folklorists that I know, right? It's like, oh, is this like, this is like we are seeing lore, quote unquote, being developed in an interesting way, right? Or mythology. Then you would have, I think, I mean, Sellers pushback. It's like, well, we know the point though, right? And it becomes a question of belief in some extent, right? Like the people writing these things here too, in the same sense of like, the sort of community effort around SCP, the SCP wiki and those types of stories, but they can be very scary, right? And they build on these sorts of tropes, right? Like contemporary sort of UFO folklore type of things too, and also go back depending on the ones you're reading. And it's, would if I was experiencing sleep paralysis and woke up, where I thought was like, is this an SCP, right? Even in some way knowing like this is a fictional, like this is like a community, your own literature almost, right? Like set of stories and different canons even. Um,
But it's the stories we spread, right? It's what we're familiar with, so we're gonna connect.
right.
That's
Right. Like, yeah,
weird.
YouTube, like, dude, you gotta read, like, you know what SCP is, right? Like, this is great board game.
And the way these are created is to be steeped in some sort of reality so we can connect it to our life, so it can feel scarier because it's more personal, which is how, like, almost every, like, scary story, every legend, every piece of folklore that's meant to be scary, it is. Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And developing things sort of in that direction,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah. That makes sense.
I also want to go back actually and think about this too, because when we were talking about this and like witches, it made me wonder if there's like a gender disparity in people who experience sleep paralysis. If you think about it in terms of witches, right, who are primarily women prosecuted in this sense, right? Or the association was certainly strong, not entire, like not exclusively, but predominantly associated with them. I don't know at the time, or if you know anything about if women or men experience this more often than not, and different ways that has sort of been, I guess, part of thinking about this.
So we talked about how people who had hard labor as their jobs, people who had more anxiety, like these studies showed that they were more likely to go and experience sleep paralysis. On top of that, people who slept on their backs more at night were more prone to experience sleep paralysis, and especially that feeling of something pressing on your chest
Yeah.
while you're experiencing that. And then because of this connection, it mainly was pregnant women who had to sleep on their backs because they were very pregnant who experienced sleep paralysis. And this goes back to the witch trials, maybe a little bit further than the witch trials, and this survived after the witch trials. And it's another, like, it's a very cross-cultural piece that the mother, like pregnant mothers, will get sleep paralysis, and then it was not necessarily a good thing if they did, not because people thought that witches were being sent to them, but because of something they themselves were doing. So while men, we have tons and tons and tons of records of men experiencing sleep paralysis, especially during the witch trials, because that is what led people to get accused of being a witch. For women, it meant that something bad was going to happen to their child, and they were doing that. Like, it was their fault. They were blamed for it, even though they were, like, the victim of it. So we have the Mara, or the nightmare, in German, but we also have, like, a specific elf figure in German
Right.
that people believe specifically would attack either new mothers or pregnant mothers. And if that were the case, it meant that their child would become one. So they were perpetuating the cycle, and it put them in like a bad position. Whereas men who experienced this, they were the victims. There was nothing bad that was going to happen to them or their child. It was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry that happened to you, that woman like sent the old hag or a demon to sit on your chest. That sounds scary. But for women, it was like, wow, you weren't doing what you should have done while you were pregnant. Your child's gonna be a demon.
Yeah, yes. Going back and thinking about like finding the root cause of this sort of thing, right? It's like you must have done something incorrect. Unsurprising considering how terrifying and sort of perilous being pregnant in the whole process was at the time, right? Or certain periods of time being it certainly a much more dangerous and much less successful thing, right? And you're much more concerned with, will my child survive? What do I do if I have confirmation bias of things? Again, this is back to the like the Bergtagen sort of, how do you explain obvious neurodivergency or physical, different like things not working right, like,
Yeah.
or not being quote unquote correct. With the midwife there, it's like, this isn't something isn't normal, quote unquote here, right? And yeah, I can see that yeah, like not just self-reflexivity, right, but like other societal like telling them it's like, oh, must have been something you did, right? Especially if you're trying other things, or this is, an ongoing, whether you're first, right, or you've been unsuccessfully trying to have a child for a while. And that too, I wouldn't shock me, I guess, if it was almost like a warning in a way, right? When we think of, I guess, back to like the Earl Koenig again, right? These sort of like elves or these figures who will kidnap your
Yeah.
children, right? As you in some ways supernaturally marked,
Yeah.
and at some point, the Elf King is going to come and kidnap your child, to take them away, which is a very scary sort of process today.
Yeah.
Or even like even think about today.
And then that also like leads it into like not only did this experience of like sleep paralysis, if we're blaming it on an elf, then we can say, well, oh, my child might be a little different some way, and that's because I had sleep paralysis. It is a supernatural force. It is not something that naturally happens to people, and people aren't just different. It's the elves.
Yeah.
We're blaming something else for people just having differences. Or we're blaming like the witches or
Right, we're turning people into the differences
yeah,
we would like to blame, right?
exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
So what is, I mean, for you as part of this larger project, why was sleep paralysis one of the topics you wanted to talk about?
Oh, that's a good question. I wanted to mainly highlight that when we experience things that we don't necessarily have an explanation for, and when we also have very strong imaginations, it can really solidify our assumptions, and that can then cause real harm to people sometimes, like again with the witch trials, or it can just cause people to be alienated or discriminated against, like we were talking about with changelings, with being blamed on children or being blamed on somebody who might have a disability, or honestly, like sometimes it just boils down to like somebody's a little bit outside of the norm, whether they're like a little bit more outspoken and people don't like it, they get blamed. But all in all, like the reason why I wanted to highlight this tradition is to let folks know how powerful experiencing something can be on their belief systems.
Right. It's a very concrete example, right, of when we think about I think there's a tendency to be very abstract when we think about something like the witch trials, where it's like, oh, we could never do right. Like we know now better. We know, like, you go, whether you believe in magic or not. It's like magic isn't real, right? These were all like, yes, these were all terrible things done based on assumptions of nothing, right? Though, like they were just picking on them when there were real things happening to make people believe these things, not necessarily just like, I mean, yes, like reasons why you would specify someone being a witch, being social, you don't like them, right? You have a feud with this person, and you're trying to get them to be there. But the concrete experience can just make that much more real in a way that I think when we think about it in the abstract doesn't come through.
Yeah, and on top of that, I think today we still have some quite like we know today that it's a disturbance in like REM sleep, right?
Yep.
But there's still like some ambiguity around there. Like, why do people see very similar things? Why are they experiencing like today? Why are they experiencing the Hat Man? And we talked about that might be influence from pressures in our society right now, but that still gives it like a why. And that's why it's still important to like why we are still sharing this story because we don't have all the answers. And that's why again, experiences now influence us to believe a different figure
Right.
this time.
Folklore has not gone away, even though we think about it in these very, oh, it's something that happened like a long time ago. People folklore and things like that. So, no, like it's still proliferating today, and people still think about these things in these sorts of ways sometimes.
So, are there any last questions? Anything else do you feel like you want to add or clarify?
No, I don't have any. No, this is very fun. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So, real quick, last thing I do with all my guests plug what you're working on, whatever you want folks to read or see, or whatever you are excited about.
I have nothing to plug. I'm just continuing to try to plug away at this dissertation and get it done as soon as possible. But I guess once that is finished and titled and everything else, I can let you know and you can proliferate out. Like, look, Taylor did a thing.
Yeah, we'll definitely spread the word because your research sounds super, super interesting too. And if you like horror kind of things and stuff, it's along the same lines. Okay, well, thank you for being here.
No, thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Beyond the Folklore. As I said many times in this podcast, experience can really shape the way we view the world, and it can be a powerful thing. Making sense of experience that we don't understand can even shape our belief systems and our worldviews. On top of that, I keep saying that imagination can be an incredibly powerful thing. So I want to leave you with one final question. Have you ever had an experience that you can't necessarily explain? In what ways did you try to rationalize it? How much of your imagination goes into rationalizing these impossible, unexplainable experiences? And how has that shaped you today? Thank you for listening and stay tuned for future episodes.